So, what I'm going to be telling you over the next hour is my story. I will tell you about Gilad Shalit at the end, but what I'm going to talk about mostly is what I tried to do and eventually succeeded in doing over a course of 5 years and 4 months to bring Gilad Shalit home after he was abducted. My involvement in the story begins almost a year before Shalit was abducted. In September of 2005, I was attending an Israeli-Palestinian conference in Switzerland on the future of Jerusalem. And I received a phone call from my wife, Edna, saying that one of her first cousins had disappeared. Sasson Nuriel worked in a factory in Mishur Adumim, an industrial zone outside of Ma'aleh Adumim in the West Bank. He had worked there for many years. He had many Palestinian friends. He's an Iraqi Jew and spoke fluent Arabic. In addition to working in this factory, in order to support his family, he would, when he heard of opportunities to purchase and sell equipment from restaurants and factories, he would look into that. That's the business that he understood. And a colleague at work of his, a Palestinian colleague of work of his, told him about a factory in Ramallah that had closed down and the equipment was for sale. And he was enticed to go to Ramallah one afternoon. And as I said, he didn't come home. Edna got phone calls from the family who knew of my 30-year involvement in working with Palestinians. And they asked me if I could use my contacts to see if Sasson Nuriel was anywhere in Ramallah or in the Ramallah area. I picked up the phone from Switzerland and called my Palestinian partner at work, Mr. Hanna Signora, and asked Hanna to go to Ramallah to ask around, to search around. He went to Ramallah. He visited the different police and security installations. He met with the commander of the Ramallah police station, someone who I had known from years before, and didn't come up with anything. 6 days later, Hamas issued a videotape showing my wife's cousin handcuffed, blindfolded. He had been tortured, and he recited a speech in which he called on Israel to release Palestinian prisoners in exchange for his freedom. Several days later, he was murdered. The Israeli security forces found his body. We went to his funeral. We went to Shiva at his family house. It was a tragic scene. Just a little while before we had traveled back from a family engagement with Sasson in the car, and we got to know each other a little bit, and he had talked about working with Palestinians and knowing Palestinians and wanting peace. And here I'd been working for peace with Palestinians for 25, 30 years, and with all the contacts and everyone that I knew, I could do nothing to save my wife's first cousin. I swore to myself at that time that if ever again an opportunity arose where I could help to save a human life because of the work that I've been doing in the context that I have, that I would not rest until I succeeded. In April of 2006, I attended a conference on Palestine organized by the United Nations in Cairo. A common friend from Gaza introduced me to Professor Mohammed Migdad, a professor of economics at the Islamic University of Gaza, a member of Hamas. He was the first person from Hamas I had ever met. I was the first Jew he had ever met. He had traveled from Gaza to Cairo because he heard that at this UN conference there might be some Israelis there, and he wanted to meet an Israeli to talk to. When we were introduced, I suggested that we go out for a coffee break. We went out, we continued talking for about 6 hours during that conference. It was fascinating. It was a kind of deja vu for me because the things that I heard from him about what he understood about Israel and about Jews were the same kind of things I had heard from PLO people 30 years ago, as if 30 years had not gone by and nothing had changed. It was so fascinating that we decided that we would continue discussing and debating and dialoguing. I suggested that we expand our dialogue to include other Israelis and other members of Hamas. And he liked the idea, and he agreed. And he said he would get other colleagues of his from Hamas at the Islamic University in Gaza to join in, and I would bring in some other Israeli academics and people would be interested in having dialogue with Hamas. I checked the whole legal situation and found out we could do it, but we had to do it abroad. We couldn't do it in Israel. Hamas people couldn't come into Israel. We couldn't do it in Gaza because Israelis couldn't go to Gaza. I found 4 countries that were willing to host these talks, 4 countries which are not Arab countries, which have relations both with Israel and Hamas. Anyone want to guess which 4 countries? Sorry? Turkey. Sweden is part of the European Union. Hamas is a terrorist organization in Europe. It could not be any country of the European Union. Switzerland. Not an Arab country. No, we didn't think of going as far as South Africa. Switzerland, Norway, Turkey, and Russia. And we decided, after receiving the kindest invitation from the Russians, that we would do the first talks in Russia. So the Russian embassy asked me to get copies of the visas of the Palestinian participants, copies of their passports so they could arrange visas, and I contacted Professor Migdad, and he said he would take care of it, and he would send them to me, and I waited a day, and 2 days, and 3 days, and a week, and 2 weeks, and they didn't come. And I understood there was a problem. So I went down to Gaza. I have an Israel-issued press card. At that time, I could gain entry into Gaza. I went to the Islamic University and met with Professor Migdad, and we drove in his car together to the Hamas Prime Minister's office and met with Dr. Ahmed Youssef, who was one of the senior political advisors, one of the ideologues of the Hamas movement, someone who had been educated and taught as a professor in the United States, had a wider world view, was often presented as the moderate voice of Hamas, often pens op-ed pieces in the Washington Post and the New York Times. So I presented to Dr. Ahmed Youssef, together with Professor Migdad, the idea of our dialogue. And Ahmed Youssef liked the idea and said, in order to give you political coverage, I will join the group. So I went back to Jerusalem and I waited for Professor Migdad to send me the copies of the passports. And I waited a day and 2 days and 3 days and a week and 2 weeks, and it didn't come. And I understood that the political leadership of Hamas vetoed the talks. No direct contact with Israelis. That's our policy. No dialogue, official or unofficial. And we had no chance of moving forward. June 25th, 2006, early in the morning, 8 Palestinian combatants emerged from a tunnel inside the Kerem Shalom army base on the Israel side of the Gaza border. They shoot with a rocket-propelled grenade at a tank at the edge of the base. 2 soldiers step out of the tank. Hanan Barak and Pavel Slutzker are shot and killed on the spot. A 3rd soldier emerges from the tank. A hand grenade is thrown at the tank. He is wounded and dragged off into Gaza. It took an hour before the army knew that they were missing a soldier. As soon as they discovered that they were missing a soldier, Gilad Shalit, the army started a military operation aimed at closing the Gaza Strip, aimed at preventing him from being smuggled out of Gaza. 3 days later, they started Operation Summer Rains. The point of Operation Summer Rains was to prevent Shalit from being taken out of Gaza and for the Palestinian public and leadership to know that they're going to pay a very heavy price for abducting an Israeli soldier. Israel bombed the electrical networks, the water networks, the road systems, the bridges, and began a deep military operation inside of Gaza to try and locate Gilad Shalit. 6 days after his abduction, I received a phone call from Professor Migdad in the morning, my friend from the Islamic University of Gaza, who said, Gershon, we're being bombed, we have no electricity, we have no water, we have to do something. I asked him, Mohammed, what do you think we can do? He said, let's try to open up a channel of communication. He got in his car and drove to the office of the Hamas Prime Minister, Ms. Ismail Haniyeh. Half an hour later, I received a phone call from the Director General of the Prime Minister's office, Dr. Mohammed Madhoun, who told me that a little while in the day someone else would be calling me who would be my liaison. Later that morning, Ghazi Hamad called me. Ghazi Hamad was the spokesperson of the Hamas government. He was a political advisor to the Prime Minister. He was an intellectual from Hamas, a veterinarian by training. He had been the editor of the first Hamas newspaper, and when they surprisingly won the elections, he was appointed as one of their young leaders to be the spokesperson of the government. There were several things that surprised me immediately about Ghazi Hamad. For one, he spoke to me in Hebrew. Ghazi had spent time, like many Palestinians, in Israeli prison. He learned to speak English and Hebrew in prison. He learned a lot about politics in prison. He told me later that he also learned about negotiating in prison because he was one of the people involved as the spokesperson in the prison and negotiated with the Israeli prison authorities. I said to him, you can speak to me in Arabic or you can speak to me in English. It's okay. He said to me, I like to speak Hebrew. That surprised me. The second thing he said was, in trying to figure out how to open up a line of communication, he suggested that perhaps we could arrange a phone call between himself or the prime minister and the father of the soldier. I was also surprised by that. It took me several hours to find the phone number of Noam and Aviva Shalit. I found it midday. I spoke to them and asked them if they would be willing to speak to someone from Hamas. They told me, of course. We want to know where our son is. We want to know if he's alive. We want to know what they want to free him. Later that afternoon, a conversation took place between Ghazi Hamad and Noam Shalit. This was the first official contact between official Hamas and the Israeli side, represented at this point by the Shalit family. I thought that in order to move forward and open up a formal negotiation, it would be necessary to get a sign of life that Gilad Shalit was in fact alive, and that whoever we were talking to were the people who were holding Shalit, that they were the official channel. Whoever I was talking to or Israel was talking to was going to lead at the end to the people holding Shalit. So I demanded from Ghazi Hamad that he should deliver to the captors a message that we want to receive a sign of life. And I consulted with the Shalits about that as well. Ghazi Hamad came back to me with their demands. They said Hamas would provide a videotape of Gilad Shalit in exchange for 350 women and minor prisoners to be released by Israel. At this point, there were some 11,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons. Amongst them, 350 of them were minors and women. I needed, at this point, Hamas also wanted a ceasefire. In other words, they wanted Israel to stop bombing them. This was the deal. This was their demand for a videotape proving that Gilad Shalit was alive. I needed at this point to get this message to the Prime Minister Olmert. Now, Prime Minister Olmert knew me. I know him. We did not exactly share the same political bench. And I knew that if I were to pick up the phone to the Prime Minister's office and say, I need to speak to the Prime Minister because I have a message from Hamas, I was not going to get very far. But I also knew the Prime Minister's daughter, Dana Olmert. Dana Olmert was an activist in the left in Israel, a supporter of Peace Now, a supporter of Palestinian rights. And I picked up the phone and I called up Dana Olmert and I asked her if she would be a conduit to deliver messages to her father about Gilad Shalit. And she said, yes, of course. She also said that my father won't listen. She said, my father doesn't trust Arabs. Of all the Arabs, he trusts the Palestinians least. And more than that, he has the least amount of confidence and trust in Israelis who work with Palestinians.